Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the bizarre Roman arena drama where fairness is totally optional. Hungry lions and subtlety both got tossed into the arena along with the prisoners. So before you get too comfy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually dig what I'm doing here. And hey, drop a comment telling me which channel you're watching and what time it is. It's always fun to see who's hanging out with us from all over the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing white noise. Let's embark on tonight's journey together. The Roman arena wasn't built for sports. It was all about the show and probably a great way for emperors to dodge paperwork. Today, we have stadiums for football. The Romans had stadiums for chaos. Walk into the arena expecting fairness, and you'll be as disappointed as a picnic goer caught in a thunderstorm. The crowd wasn't there for balance. They didn't come to see who fought best. Nope. They came to watch who fell the most spectacularly bonus points for dramatic flair. Extra credit for flailing arms and tragic facial expressions. Honestly, the Roman definition of entertainment was pretty clear: a perfect fight between two well-trained gladiators. Sure, that happened, but the real crowd pleasers were the openers, criminals, prisoners, or just really unlucky folks who accidentally owed a senator's money. These poor souls were handed a sharp spoon and told to make it dramatic. And, oh, did they deliver? The arena wasn't just a stadium. It was a pressure cooker. Plagues, grain shortages, and the occasional fire. People usually coped by watching someone else have a really bad day in a controlled environment. And best of all, it was free. Sponsored by the emperor. The show was out in the open. So hey, like me, if you're feeling generous, you got grain, a seat, and the spectacle of someone running from an angry elephant. What more could you want? Even the architecture screamed inequality. The emperor had primo seats. Senators got cushions. And everyone else got stone benches and sunstroke. The folks actually in the arena had an audience. So, let's be real, fairness was not a design priority here. This wasn't a fencing match. This was ancient Rome's version of a dinner theater. If your dinner included fried rats in a dorm and the play ended with screaming, you were in the right place. If you were one of the performers, you weren't judged on your lack of grace. You were judged on how loud. The crowd went when you tripped and face-planted into the net. Nothing screams community service like forcing an untrained civilian to fight a heavily armed pro-warrior in front of 50,000 strangers. The Romans had a word for this kind of entertainment. While we have game shows and cooking contests, they preferred something with a bit more risk and way fewer rules. Enter the gladiator versus amateur showdown, a thrilling tradition where a trained killer faced off against a baker with a sword or an existentially troubled official. These weren't one-off accidents. This was planned. Sometimes the amateurs volunteered. Sometimes they were convicted criminals. And sometimes they were just folks who really should have read the fine print. Contrary to modern movie logic, not all gladiators were anonymous slaves. Some volunteered, some were celebrities, and all were well trained. They lived in schools, had trainers, and were basically pro athletes except with more armor and fewer endorsement deals. Now, imagine one of them fighting. Someone who learned sword fighting by watching shadows on a wall. The outcome's predictable, and that's the point. This isn't about suspense. It's about spectacle. The crowd didn't want a fair fight. They wanted to cheer for the obvious winner while pretending the other guy had a chance. It's basically ancient Rome's version of watching a squirrel try to drive a chariot. And for the amateurs, there were options. Option 1 survived long enough to make a slight impression. The second option survived long enough for the crowd to feel sorry for you. The third option, get beaten so fast and hard that the crowd laughs and the emperor nods approvingly. If you're especially charming or dramatic, you might even get a stay of execution. Romans loved a good underdog story, especially if that underdog spilled a lot of blood, but most of the time, the outcome was decided before the fight even started. The crowd knew it, the fighters knew it, even the sand guy knew it. Let's say you got accused of a crime in ancient Rome. Maybe you stole something. Maybe you stared at the emperor's statue a little too long. Maybe your neighbor just really hated you. Congrats! You've just qualified for a special guest appearance in the arena. And by special guest, we mean you get up close and personal with a lion. Surprise! Damnatio ad bestias, or condemnation to the beasts, was the Roman way of asking what if. Our justice system was also a zoo. Rome's solution to everything from theft to treason was simple toss the accused into the arena, open the gates, crank up the music, and let chaos reign. The lions weren't your average house cats either. They were usually imported from North Africa and treated like star performers. They had better rides than most locals, and sometimes better snacks too. Meanwhile, prisoners got a robe and a vague sense of doom. No armor, no weapons, sometimes just a stick, because nothing screams fair fight, like handing someone a twig and saying, "Make it interesting." This wasn't a battle, it was a message. The empire wasn't just punishing you, turning you into part of the show. The more dramatic the final moments, the louder the crowd cheers, the emperor grins wider, and everyone conveniently forgets about their overdue rent. Oh, and yes, they brought their kids too, because why go to a forum when you can teach your kids some solid life lessons like don't cheat or you'll end up as lunch? Sometimes the condemned surprise everyone. They run, dodge, climb. There's at least one story about a guy who faked his death so well that the lion got bored. Too bad the crowd didn't. They made sure the show went on. If you think this sounds harsh, the Romans probably agreed. But if you suggested ditching the lions, well, that'd ruin the vibe. So, let's say the lion fight ends and the crowd's satisfied watching unarmed prisoners meet their fate. What's next, of course? We arm some folks and send them back in, but with crazier, scarier animals. Enter Venatio, Rome's version of man versus wild. If wild was incredibly pissed off and the guy was wearing gladiator sandals, these were staged hunts where specially trained warriors, or frankly anyone present who didn't owe too many favors, got weapons and were told, try not to look scared. The arena became a fake wilderness, fake trees, imported sand, maybe some bushes if someone had the budget. Then, wild animals got released. Cheetahs, bears, ostriches, rhinos, crocodiles, basically anything that could trample, charge, or utterly confuse the crowd. The warriors were expected to fight with spears, nets, or in some cases, absolutely nothing useful. There are stories of guys sent in with slingshots or sticks, basically the same as yelling, "Please stop," while a wild boar charges. And here's the twist: it still wasn't a fair fight. It was the exact opposite. Sometimes animals were sick, drugged, or starved to keep things manageable. Other times, they were just thrown into chaos. Unsure whether to attack or audition for a tragedy, the crowd yelled, "Please stop," as a wild boar charged. And here's the twist: but it still wasn't a fair fight. It went the other way. Sometimes animals were sick, drugged, or starved just to keep things under control. Other times, they were just tossed into chaos, not sure whether to attack or audition for a tragedy. But who cares? The goal wasn't survival. It was all about the show. Did the crowd care about the animals? Nope. If a rhino tossed a guy in the air like a decorative coin, the crowd went wild. If a man won, they cheered even louder. No losses, just entertainment. And sometimes the animals even teamed up. According to another story, a bear and a lion supposedly ignored humans and started fighting each other. The crowd loved it. The organizer probably got a promotion. This wasn't hunting. It wasn't fighting. It was whatever weird thing happens when a tsu. By this point, the Roman arena had its theme down. Take something brutal and make it weirder. But when they really wanted to impress the crowd, they dove into mythology. Because why just execute someone when you can reenact a legend while doing it? This quirky tradition was called the Deadly Wordplay Games. Sadly, it wasn't a game, but a public execution mixed with storytelling and some creative sentencing. Imagine a condemned dude dressed as Icarus, strapped with fake wings, and pushed off a platform. Nope. He didn't fly. Nope. It wasn't subtle. Romans loved mythology. Gods, heroes, and tragic endings. So instead of quietly handling criminals, they turned their deaths into performances. The crowd didn't just watch justice, they watched art, violent fundraising art. Take the story of Prometheus. Myth says he was chained to a rock and had issues with an eagle in the Roman arena. They ditched the rock, used stage props. But the eagle, that was the real deal, or Orpheus, the tragic musician trying to rescue his wife from the underworld. The Roman version was a guy in a robe carrying a lyre across the arena. Then, some poor sod would quietly release a few giant, completely uninterested animals. It wasn't just about the music. Of course, the crowd ate it up. Eventually, culture and entertainment became one. You could feel classy recognizing the legend, and still snicker when the dude playing Apollo trips over his own sandals. Were these performances exactly true to the original stories? Nope. Accuracy wasn't the point. The spectacle happened. If they got the plot right, great. If not, they just invented a new version where Hercules lost a foot. To be clear, this wasn't theater. The performers weren't actors. They were condemned criminals expected to bring the story to life before its grand finale. No bows, no applause, just a timely nod from the emperor and a crowd feeling a bit more cultured, even though someone just got carted off to the chopping block. Just when you think the arena couldn't get any more epic, Rome says, what if we turn it into a swimming pool? Yep. At various points in early history, this arena hosted fake naval battles called naumachia, because once you've turned executions into theater, the logical next step is reenacting a sea battle inside a building nowhere near the sea. Roman engineers, clearly talented and with way too much time on their hands, figured out how to flood the arena floor not symbolically, but with real water, the kind that makes boats float and panics sailors who have no clue what they're doing. The plan: fill the floor, toss in a few boats, and stage a battle with real people who probably knew less about rowing than the audience. Sometimes these fake battles reenacted famous sea clashes. Other times, it was just prisoner crews told, row, fight, and try not to look like you've never seen a person before. And let's talk about the boats. Of course, they were smaller than real warships. Try fitting a whole fleet into an arena and see how far you get. But they were still painted, flagged, and packed with real weapons, meaning someone was bound to fall in, get shoved overboard, or just jump because, honestly, it seemed like the better option. The audience watched from above, like cruise ship passengers at a buffet. Roman engineers, who clearly had both talent and way too much free time, figured out how to flood the arena floor not with symbols, but with actual water, the kind that floats boats and freaks out inexperienced sailors. The plan was simple: fill the floor, toss in a few ships, and stage a battle with real people who usually knew less about rowing than the audience. Sometimes these fake battles reenacted famous sea clashes. Other times, it was just teams of prisoners told row, fight, and try not to look like you've never seen a person before. And let's talk about those ships. Of course, they were smaller than real warships. Try fitting an entire fleet into an arena and see how far you get. But they were still painted, flagged, and armed with real weapons, which means someone probably fell, got pushed, or just jumped overboard because it seemed like the better option. The crowd watched from above, like cruise ship passengers at a buffet, both confused and entertained. Nobody really cared about naval tactics. They just wanted to see if someone would fall off the boat in a spectacularly tragic way. Bonus points if they shouted something poetic while doing it. And yeah, there were definitely dramatic moments, ships crashing, fighters jumping over decks, people accidentally stabbing allies. Honestly, it wasn't naval strategy. It was floating chaos with costumes. Eventually, the arena stopped being flooded for these shows, probably because water and ancient concrete don't mix well. Even if half the participants couldn't swim and the other half couldn't steer, sometimes even staged battles weren't dramatic enough. That's when the organizers dropped the party pack blindfolds, chains, mismatched weapons, and complete disregard for the laws of physics or common courtesy. Why? Because fairness is boring. But watching someone try to fight blindfolded comedy gold for everyone except the poor blindfolded guy. A popular twist was picking a genuinely skilled fighter and making their life way harder just for laughs, stripping off their armor, shortening their weapons, or handing them something utterly useless, like a net or worse, a wooden sword. Nothing screams good luck like walking into the arena clutching what looks like a kid's toy. Then came the chains. Sometimes warriors were shackled by the ankles, wrists, or both, because obviously, if you were trained to survive a brutal armed duel in front of thousands, what you really needed was to be physically restrained during the fight. Plus, it made dodging way more understandable. Some poor souls were forced to fight while literally tied together. Yep, together. They called it the deadly three-legged race. All right, not officially, but it should have been. Imagine trying to survive when your partner's panic is totally messing up your steps. One trips, both fall, crowd goes wild. Of course, not everyone got these ridiculous gigs. Gladiators were investments. Crowd favorites with reputations didn't have to do the dumbest stunts, unless the audience was bored and the emperor wanted a laugh. Then all bets were off. And don't forget those surprise opponents who popped up sometimes. You think you're fighting one dude, then bam, a trapdoor opens, and a second guy or even something clawed and wild shows up. Think WWE. But suddenly there's a bear on the floor. The ancient Romans did that. Seriously, none of this was in any rule book, mainly because there was no rule book. Just a checklist. Entertainment check. Absurdity check. Can we clean up before the next fight? Sure, why not? You might think the Roman arena, with all its glorious chaos, gave the crowd a breather between acts, a little time to chill, grab some olives, or maybe gossip about how well accessorized the gladiators were. And technically, there was a break, but in true Roman fashion, even that break was turned into a show. Welcome to Meridiani, the lunchtime spectacle. Mornings had beast hunts. Afternoons promised gladiator gems, and lunch was for some procedural rituals, public executions. Because nothing goes better with your midday bread than empire-approved legal drama. These executions weren't spur of the moment. They were scheduled, staged, and timed like a theater production. The condemned, usually criminals, deserters, or folks who annoyed the wrong official, were paraded before the crowd for some no-nonsense justice. No one expected drama. This wasn't a fight. It was a warning. Don't be this guy, said the empire. Also, enjoy your olives. And the methods, let's just say they got creative, sometimes quick and tidy. Moving on with the show. More ceremonial numbers. Public executions. Because nothing pairs better with your lunch sandwich than the idea of the empire's legal process. These executions weren't spontaneous. They were scheduled, organized, and timed. Like a stage play, the condemned, usually criminals, deserters, or folks who annoyed the wrong official, were brought before the crowd to watch justice done publicly. No fuss. Nobody expected drama. This wasn't a fight. It was a warning. Don't be this guy, the empire said. Also, enjoy the olives. And the methods, let's just say, creative. Sometimes it was quick, neat, and the show moved on. Other times, it got unnecessarily complicated, especially if the person made a scene. The Romans believed justice should be efficient, theatrical, and ideally backed by someone wearing a toga. By now, the crowd was used to it. Kids wanted better seats. Street vendors sold snacks. No one blinked. They even got annoyed when it dragged on. Come on, someone muttered. We're just here for the real fights, which is exactly why this part got ridiculous. It drags on and gets annoying. Come on, someone mutters. We're just here for the real fights. That's what makes this part so ridiculous. For the audience, these execution scenes were just extra content, like ads, but instead of pitching soap. They're proof of why you shouldn't steal stuff, and if that freaks you out, well, that's exactly the point. The arena wasn't just an arena, it was a carefully staged control show. Every moment, even the breaks, was designed to remind the public who's boss and what happens if you dare challenge that boss. Kiddings. Modern sports, the ref calls the shots. In the Roman arena, the final say came from thousands of sweaty fans who probably ate too much bread and had one too many drinks. Yep, in Rome, justice was a group effort. After a gladiator match, the loser didn't always die on the spot. If he fought well, or at least gave it his all, the crowd got to decide, would he live to fight another day, or become a cautionary tale? Enter the thumb. You've probably heard a thumbs down means death. Except, surprise historians aren't totally sure which thumb means what. Some say thumbs up meant execution, like drawing a sword. Others claim thumbs down meant sheathing the sword, aka mercy. Some think those gestures had nothing to do with thumbs at all, just vague hand waves that made gladiators wish the Romans had invented scorecards. Either way, the crowd's reaction mattered, and they weren't shy about it. They came ready to cheer, boo, and shout unsolicited opinions at folks fighting for their lives. It's like ancient Yelp, just with more togas and fewer stars. If a gladiator bored them, he'd get the silent treatment worst-case scenario if he got fired up. The crowd screamed for mercy or punishment, or both. Honestly, it was kinda confusing but very loud. Some gladiators wanted fan love. They played the crowd. They had fans. Yep, actual fans. Some were known by name and even had merch to sell. Okay, not official merch, but people still wore carved trinkets. Same idea. And if the emperor showed up, oh boy, things got political fast. He could override the crowd, grant mercy, or order execution. Either way, he read the room like a stand-up comic, but with way more serious consequences and fewer jokes. Yeah, depending on the emperor. So, even though the games looked chaotic, they were strangely democratic, at least for the fighters. If you entertained, you got a chance. If not, the crowd was ready to vote with their voices, their hands, and sometimes their sandwiches, because in the arena, survival wasn't just about skill. The goal was to put on a great show and hope everyone was in a good mood. Among all the animals you'd expect to meet in the Roman arena, lions, tigers. That guy with the net wild boars probably aren't top of your list. But in ancient Rome, boars weren't just food. They were entertainment, and not the cute petting zoo kind. Wild boars were no joke. These were muscular tusked males born in the forest. Think angry bowling balls from nature, but less mercy and way stronger. Now imagine one charging at you while the crowd roars, and you're trying to look heroic in your leather skirt. Gladiators trained in many things. But wild boar hunting strategy wasn't high on the curriculum. Sometimes they used spears for animal hunts. Venatio animals were released into the arena for gladiators to kill with. Spears. Other times, to spice things up, the boars were introduced mid-fight. As surprise guests, nothing makes a spectacle livelier than a 300-pound pig crashing the stage uninvited. In at least one case, the record tells of a wild animal so rowdy it barreled through the props, ignored the trainer, and nearly plowed into the front row. The Romans, oh, they loved it. Nothing screams public funding success like pork flying through the air. And if you're wondering why the Romans thought this was entertaining, the magic word is unpredictability. A lion looks majestic, a tiger is terrifying, but a wild boar hilarious, especially when it's underestimated. Even emperors got in on the action, some through themed hunts just to flaunt their weird animal collections, including those extra feisty boars, all to prove their empire had plenty of bacon and the ultimate flair. Meanwhile, the fighters, mostly just trying not to die. You can train to dodge a sword, but guessing it's a human and then realizing it's a wild boar, total chaos. Imagine boar tusks turning your kneecaps into a hazard. And in classic Roman entertainment tradition, nobody asked the big question, should we even be doing this? They just asked, can we add another wild boar to the mix? Spoiler alert, yes. Yes, they could, and they did. The arena floor wasn't just a sandy pit. Underneath was a maze of tunnels, cages, elevators, and pulleys. These mechanical wonders let stagehands bring animals, props, or entire sets onto the arena floor with impeccable timing that would make Broadway jealous. You're a gladiator, sweating it out under that Roman sun. Just when you think you've got this, boom, the floor opens, and a leopard drops in. The fight. Just the opening act. This wasn't random. Roman event planners. Yes, that was a real job. Loved a good surprise. Why settle for a regular showpiece when you can turn it into an obstacle course featuring lurking lions? And it wasn't just animals. Sometimes chariots crashed in, sometimes fire pits, sometimes giant wooden constructions representing mythic settings like the underworld or a poorly built volcano, all designed to grab the crowd's attention and utterly confuse the participants. It turned fighting into theater, and theater into complete chaos. You weren't just fighting your opponent. You were battling the stage floor, the props, and growing suspicions that someone backstage was laughing their head off. These trapdoors were operated by teams of slaves and crew under the arena, coordinating timing with the precision of a military operation or at least a mildly chaotic circus. One wrong lever, and suddenly a bear shows up in the wrong scene, or worse, doesn't show up at all, leaving two gladiators awkwardly circling each other for 20 minutes. Thrilling for the audience, humiliating for the fighters. It was a lesson in humility and ankle awareness, because in the arena, you faced not only your opponent, but also the arena's set design and Rome's deep commitment to surprising everyone with unpleasant twists. If the gods really favored the brave, They surely respected those who didn't fall into the trapdoor mid-victory pose at first glance. Gladiator fights look like the fairest part of the arena schedule. Two trained pros facing off before a wild crowd like an ancient UFC, just with classier costumes. But of course, this is Rome, and fairness was optional. As usual, while some fights had real drama and packed stands, many were fixed faster than a politician's re-election campaign. One fighter might be a seasoned veteran with years of arena experience. The other a terrified rookie who just figured out which end of the sword is sharp and wasn't exactly married to the idea of standard weapons. Sometimes one got a long sword and shield. The other wielded a net and trident, not because it made sense strategically, but because the crowd loved a shield. The other guys got a net and a trident, not because it's tactical genius, but because the crowd loves variety, and some event organizer clearly digs chaos. These odd pairs all had names. Caesar faced off against Retiarius, the trident guy who was quite the crowd favorite. One dude decked out in armor, big helmet, traditional gear, the other barely wearing anything, wielding a fishing fork, cheered on and dodging for his life. This wasn't a fair fight. It was Speedy McBear trying not to get squashed. Why the mismatch? Because Romans loved contrast. The spectacle of two wildly different fighters was exactly the point. Two fighters decked out the same way snooze fest, but throw a clunky tank against a nearly naked rope thrower. Now that's entertainment. And if a gladiator's got a fan base or a sponsor to impress, the match might just tip in his favor, not for fairness, but to make him look cooler when he wins. Gladiators weren't just fighters. They were walking investments, brands on legs. If someone racked up impressive wins or had a flashy fighting style, the empire backed them. Fans bought figurines. Kids reenacted their victories. Merch sold itself. Yeah, it was unofficial merch, but merch all the same. Sometimes they even handed out easy wins just to keep the legend alive. The loser, either forgettable or just unlucky, maybe both, because in the arena, balance is a myth. The crowd didn't come for sportsmanship. They came to see someone get crushed and hope it's them. And if that underdog somehow wins now, that's a story. If you think Roman arenas were just swords and sand, think again. There's spin involved, but not the dramatic fall and twirl kind. No, it's politics. The arena wasn't just crowd entertainment. It was a PR machine reminding everyone exactly who's boss. Every event, every fight, every Two Tigers moment we release is part of the Empire's carefully curated message. Obey or else. Executions weren't just punishments. They were statements. Traitors, rebels, or just folks who pissed off powerful senators got public. Dramatic send-offs complete with storylines and flair. One day, you're a bad word on a scroll. Next day, you're the tragic hero in a reenactment of some myth you never signed up for. And the emperor, oh, he's not just watching, he's starring. Naturally, he's front and center, shaded, nodding thoughtfully as someone gets their head artistically chopped off. The crowd watches him as much as the fights. His reactions, crucial, thumbs up. That's not just a gesture, that's a headline. Some emperors used the games to win hearts. Remember bread and circuses? Keep 'em fed and distracted, and they won't notice the empire's broke. Others used it to intimidate. Public execution here. Surprise lion attack there. It all sends a message. And if you're lucky enough to be a famous gladiator, you might get dragged into politics. Fight well, and you're proof Rome's tough. Refuse to die properly, and suddenly you're a liability. Sometimes the whole event was staged around political stories, military victory celebrations. Great. Let's reenact that in the arena with extras and real casualties. Hosting a foreign dignitary. Let's show them a guy in armor jumping over a hippo. Yeah. The Roman arena was basically Rome's most violent press conference. Every sand toss and epic collapse was part of a bigger empire message. Rome is strong, Rome is glorious, and Rome is definitely watching. With all the mismatches, trapdoors, war pigs, and political drama, why did the arena stay open so long? Simple. Rome was addicted to spectacle, bread, and circuses. Remember, feed the people and keep them distracted so they don't notice the empire's budget is bleeding out. Others used it to intimidate. A public execution here, a surprise lion attack there, very motivating stuff. And if you got lucky enough to be a famous gladiator, you might even get political mileage. Fight well and you become Rome's shining example of strength. Refuse to die honorably. Suddenly, you're just dead weight. Sometimes the whole event was staged around political stories. Celebrate a military victory. Awesome. Let's reenact that in the arena with some extras and real casualties. Welcome a foreign dignitary. Let's show them a good time with some tigers. Nothing impresses visiting officials like a guy in armor jumping over a hippo. Yep. The Roman arena was basically the wildest press conference in Rome. Every sand throw and tragic collapse was part of the empire's grand PR strategy. Rome is strong, Rome is glorious, and Rome is definitely watching. With all the mismatches, trapdoors, armed pigs, and political messages. Why was the arena open so long? Simple. Rome was addicted to spectacle. This wasn't just shows. They were cultural events, political tools, social glue, and sometimes a sketchy form of legal therapy for a civilization desperate for distractions. This empire was huge, complicated, and prone to drama. Fires, sometimes literal fires, but give people a gladiator fight, and suddenly everything's chill. This formula for a civilization desperately in need of a hobby. This empire was huge, complicated, and constantly on fire. Literally, sometimes, but give the people a gladiator match, and suddenly everything's chill. This formula worked like a charm. A bored, overwhelmed citizen might grumble about the grain shortage, but just hand them a seat in the arena, some snacks, and front row view of a guy wrestling a leopard wearing a wig. Suddenly, life's not so bad. That's empire building 101. Distract, dazzle, repeat, and emperors loved it. These games scored instant popularity points. Want to win the crowd's love after raising taxes, throw a week-long festival, accidentally offend the Senate release some, lions, problem solved, chariots, and tigers. Want to mess with a general's head. Let your enemy play the hero in a staged myth. and forget to tell him it's just a metaphor. The arena was the original social media feed, constant updates, non-stop drama, where careers were made, enemies wiped out, and your public image could be shaped with just a thumbs-up gesture. But no comment section, just roaring applause or total silence, which in Rome was basically a protest. Even the greatest empires got tired, though over time, the shows got less flashy, animals harder to import, and the crowd less impressed. By the time Rome started falling apart, even the Roman arena was just yesterday's news. Sand and stone don't last forever, and neither does attention span. Still, the legacy sticks around, even today. We remember the arena not as a sports ground, but as a monument to how far society will go for a good show. Unfair, not very nice. Definitely, but unforgettable, though, absolutely. Because when you build a stage for 50,000 people and fill it with fire, iron, and politics, subtlety is not the goal. You're aiming for history. Now picture yourself as an ancient Irish farmer. It's April 30th, and the wind's changing. You look out over the rolling hills and mumble, "All right, time to light some fires." Welcome to Beltane, the ancient Celtic fire festival that's not just about kicking off summer, the real deal survival, while modern folks pop open sunscreen and complain about the heat. Your ancestors were busy stacking wood and herding cattle between two blazing fires. Why? Because they believed the smoke could purify, protect, and maybe even impress the local spirits. In this world, fire wasn't just a handy tool, it was living power, a bridge between worlds. Lighting it wasn't casual, it was sacred. Druids, the spiritual MVPs of the community, ran the show. They'd shout slogans, make dramatic gestures, and finally summon a central bonfire called the Need Fire, from which every household's fire in the area would be lit. Think of it as a spiritual reset button, but with more sparks and fewer instructions. As the fire crackled, villagers would herd their livestock, cows and sheep between the two fires. Sounds extreme, right, but it was insurance against sickness and bad luck. Want your herd healthy and productive, pass them through fire. Want to keep your fertility, then jump boldly over the flames yourself. Nothing says romance like a gentle song, and of course, there was dancing, naked or clothed, depending on the year and how wild everyone was feeling. Couples might jump the fire together to bond their love, while solo jumpers hoped to spark a divine connection from above. Beltane wasn't just a festival, it was a seasonal rite, a warm handshake between the mortal world and the beyond. And when the fire finally died out, embers scattered across the fields, spreading the fire's blessings over the land. Now, let's leave the damp Celtic hills and head into the dry, sun-baked heart of ancient Persia. Here, fire wasn't something to dance around hoping your sheep stayed healthy. It was a divine presence, a sacred power to be nurtured, revered, and absolutely not messed with. Welcome to Zoroastrianism, sacred power that needs nurturing, worship, and absolute respect. Welcome to Zoroastrianism. one of the oldest monotheistic religions, where fire isn't just sacred, it's truth itself. Actually, they call it Atar, a living symbol of Ahura Mazda, the cosmic sacred order. So fire isn't just a useful kitchen guest. It's the blazing icon of cosmic balance. No pressure or anything. The centerpiece of the ritual is the fire temple, where priests called mobeds tend the eternal flame that's been, for years, sometimes centuries. Think of them as holy gatekeepers, dressed not with fire extinguishers, but with bundles of sandalwood and eagle feathers to gently fan the flames. The whole idea is to keep this fire burning non-stop, untouched, unpolluted, and uninterrupted so it can just chill and glow. Basically, letting it die out is a cosmic insult, a divine fail of epic proportions. These fire rituals weren't just about solemn worship. At big festivals like Sadek and Chaharshan Besuri, the whole community would light bonfires in public squares to celebrate creation, rebirth, and the eternal battle between light and darkness. People literally jumped over fires shouting things like, "Give me your red and take away my sickly pallor." Honestly, it's basically the ancient Persian version of New Year. New me. The sparks weren't just metaphors in these moments. The fire became a messenger, carrying prayers to the heavens while also chasing away lurking demons and every bit of bad luck hiding under your rug. Even funeral rites avoided letting the fire touch the dead directly. Why? Because that would be pollution. Fire had to stay clean, pure, and non-judgmental, like an eternal therapist who's seen it all but never says a word. From the Persian point of view, fire wasn't something to be tamed. It was the sacred thread connecting humanity to the divine blueprint of the universe. A cozy, flickering flame, sure, but also a stern reminder to keep your soul and your fire in tip-top shape. Now, let's jump over to ancient Greece, where fire festivals weren't just pious rituals. They were full-on sports events, because when the Greeks honored their gods, they didn't just pray, they ran with fire. The torch relay, aka lampadromia, was the star event. Picture a sacred relay race where runners pass blazing torches like flaming batons through Athens, and the goal, not just speed. The aim was to keep that flame alive. Drop the torch or let it die, and you're out. Congrats. You just disappointed an entire city and the gods. These races honored gods tied to fire and knowledge. Hephaestus, the blacksmith god, and Prometheus, the rebellious dude who swiped fire from Olympus and handed it to humans. A bold move that earned him an eternal liver-pecking punishment from Zeus, which in Greek myth was basically a slap on the wrist. The torch race wasn't just a sport, it was a theatrical ritual. By keeping the flame alive, runners symbolized the enduring spark of divine wisdom passed to mankind. Just holding the flame wasn't enough. You had to prove you could carry it without fumbling like a clumsy apprentice in Hephaestus's workshop. And this wasn't your casual jog through olive groves. Races were often at night, with only the torchlight slicing through the dark, casting dramatic shadows on temples, pillars, and chaotic herds. The visual impact was intentional. The gods were watching, and you better make it look epic. Plus, there were deeper layers of symbolism. Prometheus's gift of fire wasn't just warmth or cooking fuel. It stood for wisdom, transformation, rebellion. When Greeks honored him with the torch race, they weren't just retelling a myth, they were subtly reminding themselves of their own clever defiance, their pursuit of civilization, even at a steep price. Winners got crowns or little statues, maybe even a jar of olive oil because, hey, this is Greece we're talking about. But the real prize was glory and maybe a temporary break from the wrath of the gods punishing the crops. So next time but the real prize is glory and maybe a temporary break from the wrath of crop punishing gods. So next time you see the modern Olympic torch relay, no, it's not just a sports thing. It's the sparkling echo of Greek reverence for stolen fire, cosmic rebellion, and the timeless art of running real fast without singeing your eyebrows. From the Greek torch relay, we head east to ancient India, where fire wasn't stolen from gods. It was the god, meet Agni, the Hindu god of fire, not just warmth and light, but the fiery deity himself, but also the universe's very own postman. His job, delivering offerings from earth to heaven via fire with 0 lost packages, no lost shipments, no customer service lines. In Vedic rituals, the sacred ceremonies of ancient India, Agni was the bridge between humans and gods. Any worthy prayer needed fire, and not just any fire. It had to be lit just right, with clarified butter and ghee added, basically. The sacred nectar of all rituals, accompanied by chants. These things were called yajnas, so important that priests spent their entire lives mastering them. Think of it as spiritual arson, more incense, less insurance claims. In a typical yajna, they'd build a sacred fire pit called a Havan Kund, usually decorated with crazy geometric patterns linked to cosmic forces. The fire had to be sparked by friction or dumb luck, not a matchstick. And once lit, Agni came alive. You weren't just staring at a fire, you were locking eyes with a god. But this wasn't a one-time thing. The most devout families kept the flame burning forever. The fire never went out, passed down from generation to generation. If it went out, it wasn't just inconvenient, it was a spiritual emergency. Some even believed it could break the universe's balance. Imagine being the guy who accidentally douses the sacred flame with water. Oh, and that's not all. Fire festivals like Lori and Makar Sankranti later evolved to celebrate this Vedic legacy with bonfires, songs, and offerings marking agricultural seasons. It's joy wrapped in smoke, purification dancing in sparks, and unlike some traditions that keep fire at arm's length, here it's close, alive, and deeply respected. Agni isn't some scary forest fire. He's honored like an ancestor, witness to every vow, every birth, every soul's passing. If ancient India saw fire as a divine messenger, ancient Egypt saw fire as the sun's breath, the god himself. Fire wasn't just a flicker, it was cosmic power embodied by Ra, the sun god riding across the sky on his blazing solar boat each night. He battled a chaotic serpent in the underworld, fueled entirely by celestial fire, no pressure, Ra. But let's zoom in on human rituals, because while Ra handled solar travel, Egyptians celebrated with fire too. Fire wasn't for warmth. It symbolized purification, protection, and rebirth. Temples were designed to catch the morning sun's rays in their darkest rooms, like the gods themselves were flipping on the lights. The most famous fire ritual was the Opet, or Wep Rene festival, marking the new year, not your usual countdown and fireworks. This was a multi-day show starring priests, incense, offerings, and most importantly, ceremonial torches paraded in processions. These torches weren't just for show. The fire symbolized Ra's rejuvenating energy returning to Earth, driving away darkness and disease, like spiritual pest control. But with sacred fireworks, even in daily life, fire played a key role but was carefully managed. Egyptians didn't cremate their dead. That was apparently a bit too final for them, but they did burn incense and holy oils at funerals. It was believed the smoke from scent offerings could lift souls up safely to the afterlife. And if those scents pleased the gods, even better. Priests kept eternal flames burning. In temples, especially those dedicated to Ra or his fiery daughter, Sekhmet. Even in daily life, fire played a crucial role but was carefully managed. Egyptians didn't cremate. That seemed a bit extreme to them, but they burned incense and sacred oils during burial rituals. They believed the smoke from offerings could carry souls upward, helping them safely cross to the afterlife. And if the scent pleased the gods, even better. Priests also kept eternal flames, burning in temples, especially those dedicated to Ra or his fiery daughter, Sekhmet, a lion-headed goddess you definitely don't want to piss off. Her festival involved fire rituals to calm her destructive side. And yes, sometimes those flames looked as red as a beard, dripping with blood, because Egyptian gods loved their symbols and a bit of drama. Fire in Egypt wasn't chaos. It was neat, graceful, and flashy. It came with scrolls, hymns, and a tight schedule. Every spark had a script. Now, let's dive into the jungle and highlands of ancient Central America, where fire wasn't just about survival, it was the universe's engine, and keeping that engine running took more than candles and good vibes. For the Aztecs, Maya, and Zapotec, fire was a sacred power controlling time, farming, even human destiny. But they didn't just throw casual parties. They rebooted the Kundalini flame. They held a fire festival every 52 years when the Aztec calendar finished. Its sacred cycle, think of it as the universe's Y2K, but with way higher stakes and zero IT support. As that terrifying day approached, every household fire across the land was snuffed out. Cities went dark. People destroyed their belongings. They fasted, prayed, and basically assumed the world might just end then at midnight. The priests climbed the sacred hill and performed a heart sacrifice ritual. Only after that heart was burned and the new flame ignited in the chest, yes, a literal chest fire, the new fire was declared reborn. From that divine spark, every household fire across the empire was relit. Fire symbolized rebirth, continuity, and cosmic approval if that fire didn't flare up. The sun might never rise again. No pressure in Maya civilization. Fire also played a key role in temple and royal dedication ceremonies. New temples were awakened by fire. They literally burned offerings in the central chamber to activate the structure, like politely inviting the divine tenants to move in. And if you were king, your coronation required the right to use fire, including incense burning and sometimes bloodletting rituals just to prove you really meant it. The Zapotecs were just as serious. Their fire god, Koyo, was tied to storms and thunder, and festivals honoring him included fire burning, dancing, and sometimes burning symbolic effigies, basically holy piñatas, with a serious flammability problem. In all these cultures, fire was a conversation with the gods, but also a need. It was hungry and needed feeding, not just with logs or copal resin, but with sacrifice. Smoke didn't just rise, it spoke. Now, let's hop on a boat into the vast Pacific, where islands scatter like fiery rocks across the ocean for ancient Polynesians. Fire was not just essential, it was a story of origins, a sacred legacy handed down from gods living inside volcanoes. In many Polynesian fire beliefs, the goddess Pele was the fierce soul of volcanoes, especially worshipped in Hawaiian myth. She wasn't some calm kitchen goddess, gently watching your pots. Nope. She was a blazing force of nature who created islands with her lava, then destroyed them in divine rage. Respecting fire in this culture wasn't optional. It was survival. People believed Pele lived in the crater of Halemaumau atop Cape Lauius, one of the world's most active volcanoes. When it erupted, it wasn't a natural disaster. It was her dramatic self-expression. Lava flows were seen as her fiery footprints, reshaping the land by divine will. People left offerings near the crater flowers, food, hymns, sometimes even hair or fingernails, because when a goddess is literally remaking geography, you want to be on her good side. Polynesian fire festivals took many forms, but one of the most captivating was Sa'afi, or the fire knife dance, still performed in places like Samoa and Tonga. It began as a warrior ritual, involving twirling blazing knives while dancing, flipping, and basically daring death to show up. It wasn't just a show, it was a spiritual display. The fire knife was seen as an extension of inner power, a dance fueled by ancestral strength. In daily life, Polynesians used fire to cook in earth ovens called umu, light paths during ceremonies, and communicate with the spirit world. Fire was the bridge between the visible and invisible, between the earthly and divine. Even funerals featured torches and hymns, guiding souls to the ancestral realm across the sea. Some island folks believe their ancestors' souls hitch a ride on flames, visible flickering in torchlight, or fireflies, messing with fire or ignoring it. That's a fast track to pissing off gods and ghosts alike. You'd think ancient Scandinavia was way too cold and damp for fiery rituals. Nope. The Vikings were actually pretty cozy with fire. in the land of icy fjords and eternal winters. Fire meant way more than just warmth. It was survival, body, and soul. At the heart of Norse myth, the cosmic duality of fire and ice. The world was born from a showdown between Muspelheim, the fiery realm, and Niflheim, the icy wasteland. When those two clashed in the primordial void called Ginnungagap, sparks literally flew. Out of that chaos came the first creature, Ymir, and then the gods. So fire wasn't just useful, it was both creator and destroyer. The scariest fire dude in Norse myth Surtur, a fire giant from Muspelheim. Prophecy says he'll ride out during Ragnarok, the Norse apocalypse, swinging a blazing sword. His job, burn the world to ashes. So yeah, fire wasn't something to mess with. On a more down-to-earth note, fire festivals marked seasonal shifts, especially late winter when the sun starts coming back. Celebrations like Ule, later merged with Christmas, were all about fire. Huge logs burned for days. Hello, Ule log, symbolizing the sun's rebirth. The longer it burned, the luckier your year ahead. Lighting the Ule fire was more than warmth, it guaranteed cosmic order. People also lit bonfires at midsummer when daylight peaked and spirits roamed freer, jumping over fire. A custom in many cultures was said to bring protection, fertility, and maybe impress your crush. And when it came to death, fire had the final say. Viking funerals weren't just slow archery contests on longboats, but cremation was definitely a thing, believed to free souls to Valhalla, aka Vangranger, the afterlife for warriors and chosen ones. Fire purified, elevated, and honored, part farewell, part transformation, and part dramatic explosion across the ancient world. Fire wasn't just life-giver, it was judge and jury. It could warm your home or incinerate your legacy. For many cultures, fire was the ultimate test, the tool of divine justice, spiritual cleansing, and cosmic reckoning. And unlike modern courts, there was no appeal. In ancient India, fire wasn't just a god, but a witness. In the Ramayana epic, Sita, wife of hero Rama, literally had to walk through fire to prove her purity after a kidnapping ordeal. The fire god Agni didn't flash a guilty verdict, but gave a divine nod. She came out unscathed and innocent. Talk about messy gender expectations. But it's a classic example of fire as ultimate truth teller in medieval and ancient Europe. Similar ideas came through brutal trials, suspects, witches, or unlucky souls sometimes had to endure fire tests, holding hot iron bars or walking on embers. If their wounds healed clean, they were innocent. If not, well, you probably don't want to be around for that debate. These tests weren't exactly morale boosters, but they show the lingering belief that fire reveals divine will in Zoroastrianism. One of the earliest notions of fire as judge appears in the Chinvat bridge concept, the crossing to the afterlife. When you die, your soul walks a razor-thin bridge over a river of molten metal. The righteous find it as soft as warm milk. The wicked, they discover the so-called divine metal isn't exactly chill. Walk over hot coals. If their wounds heal clean, they're innocent. If not, well, you probably don't want to be around for the messy argument that follows. These challenges didn't exactly boost morale, but they show the lingering belief that fire reveals divine will in Zoroastrianism. One of the earliest ideas of fire as judgment shows up in the Chinvat bridge concept, the crossroads to the afterlife. When you die, your soul crosses a razor-thin bridge over a river of molten metal. The righteous find it as gentle as warm milk. The wicked, they discover that the divine metal isn't exactly chill. Even the Aztecs, who worshipped fire devoutly, saw it as a cyclical test. If their new fire ritual failed, the world might just end. Fire, once a godly gift, could also be the universe's chosen method of total annihilation. It keeps humanity humble and, frankly, a bit hot-headed. Across these traditions, fire became a mirror. Whatever you bring to it, truth, sin, devotion, hope, or fear is what it reveals. Whether in sacred rites or terrifying trials, fire is the soul's final exam. In ancient Egypt, paying taxes wasn't just about money, it was a spiritual duty. The pharaoh wasn't your average bureaucrat. He was the divine middleman between gods and humans. So when he demanded tribute, it wasn't seen as exploitation. People believed it kept the cosmic balance, Ma'at, the sacred order of the universe. Nothing like getting taxed by a god to keep things in check. Money, as we know it, didn't really exist in early Egyptian society. So how did the pharaoh fill his royal coffers with grain? Lots and lots of grain. Annual Nile floods guaranteed fertile fields, and after harvest, scribes would show up, clipboard or rather, papyrus scroll in hand, to tally exactly how much grain you owed. They used ropes, sticks, and a gadget that was basically a frustration machine. If your land produced 10 bags, you might owe the state 3. No pay, no choice. You could lose your land, your livestock, or mysteriously get drafted into a state labor project, because you could also pay your dues with work. Those towering pyramids at Giza, not aliens or slaves. Partly built by taxpayers. No grain or goods, off you go hauling limestone, digging irrigation canals, or building the latest Horus temple. Congrats. You're now part of Egypt's National Infrastructure Initiative. The whole system was meticulously recorded by scribes, the sharp, exclusive club of literacy. They noted everything from how much wheat you owed to whether your donkey was taxable. Yep, even animals could be taxed. If it moves and has value, the state probably wants a cut. Egypt's tax system was centralized, efficient, and when needed, brutally enforced, but also flexible during famines or floods. Tax collectors might lower quotas, not out of kindness, but because dead farmers don't pay taxes. Let the Romans turn bodily functions into taxable assets in an empire of marble arenas and gladiator games. Taxes were both bureaucratic art and the source of famous grumbles. You could be taxed on land, slaves, doorways, and even urine, because nothing screams government efficiency like charging people to pee. Let's start with the infamous urine tax. Public urinals and fullers' workshops collected human pee, then used it as ammonia to clean clothes, and tan leather. So when Emperor Vespasian realized this bodily byproduct had chemical value, he did what any responsible emperor would: he taxed the tax collectors. The phrase "money doesn't stink pecunia non olet" was born when his son Titus questioned the morality of such taxes. Vespasian handed him a coin and asked if it smelled. Nope. Point made. But that was just the tip of the imperial iceberg. Rome taxed windows, too, encourage modest architecture. Owning slaves came with its own tax, and inheritance taxes could slash what you left behind. There was even a sales tax, but only for free citizens, because if you got enslaved, congrats, you became taxable property. Tax collectors, called publicani, were about as popular as a root canal. These middlemen paid the state up front for the right to collect taxes, then squeezed the people for maximum profit. Think of them as private debt collectors run by hedge funds, and if you refused to pay, smells or not, spoiler, it doesn't. That was just the surface of the imperial iceberg. Rome taxed windows, too, encourage modest architecture. Slave ownership came with its own tax. An inheritance tax could seriously cut into what you left behind. There was even a sales tax, but only for free citizens, because if you got enslaved, congrats, you became a taxable form of property. The tax collectors, called publicani, were not exactly beloved celebrities. Those middlemen paid the state up front for the right to collect taxes, then squeezed the people dry for profit. Think of them as a private debt collection company run by a hedge fund, and if you refused to pay, soldiers might show up to persuade you. Despite all this, Roman taxes funded some impressive projects: aqueducts, roads, temples, and military conquests, expanding the empire from Britain to Syria. You could argue Roman taxes both built and destroyed civilization, depending on your point of view. And yes, tax rebellions happened. Provinces groaned under the burden, and quite a few. In Central America, the Aztec Empire had one of the most complicated and organized tribute systems the world has ever seen. And no, it wasn't about gold or coins. Their currency, cocoa beans, jaguar pelts, and feathers so fine they made European kings look like they dressed in sweatpants. Unlike modern taxes, Aztec tribute worked like a giant imperial wish list. The emperor didn't ask for permission. He just wanted the best stuff from your area, delivered regularly, and preferably with zero excuses. Every city-state or kingdom under Aztec control had to pay up, meticulously recorded by scribes called calpixque. These guys carried scrolls showing exactly what you owed, not in numbers, but pictures. Mazes of maize, piles of cotton, bundles of obsidian blades, and yes, bags of cocoa beans. Think of it as a hellish pictorial invoice. Cocoa beans were especially valuable, not just food or drink, but actual currency. A few beans could buy you a tamale, a cloak, or a night out at a local human sacrifice festival. They were so prized that counterfeiters tried hollowing them out and filling them with dirt. Bold move, but also a death sentence. The Tenochtitlan tax office didn't mess around. Tribute items ranged from turkey honey to jade dust decor, up to massive tree trunks hauled miles from remote forests. One province had to regularly send embroidered warrior outfits, complete with battle-ready sandals. Another specialized in rare bird feathers, woven into headpieces for nobles and gods alike. Imagine trying to explain to your village why your tax is 30 live parrots and 2 jaguar pelts. Sorry, folks. It's Jaguar hunting day again. No tribute, expect some serious payback. Aztec tax collectors weren't shy, and rebellious provinces got a military reminder. Compliance wasn't civic duty, it was survival, despite the harsh terms. The tribute system helped the empire thrive. The capital, Tenochtitlan, was a city of floating gardens, glittering temples, and bustling markets, mostly paid for by tributary towns. Over in ancient China, taxes weren't flashy punishments or weird goods, but a matter of scale. With tens of millions of people and an empire seemingly eternal, China built a bureaucratic tax machine so precise it made Roman senators weep into their wine. Let's start with basics: rice and labor. Under the Han Dynasty, peasants were the backbone of the economy and paid taxes in 3 main forms: grain, cloth, and corvée labor. Wheat piled up in imperial granaries. Cloth went to officials and workers, meaning folks had to spend weeks or months away from home building canals, roads, or occasionally fixing the Great Wall. Think of it as tax season, but instead of paperwork, you hauled bricks for corvée labor. As the empire grew, taxes grew too. The Tang Dynasty introduced a 2-tax system to keep things simple, paid twice a year, once in summer, once in autumn, calculated based on land size and how many mouths you fed. Theoretically fair. In practice, tax collectors had a flexible understanding of fairness. Then there was the salt tax, the silent empire builder. Instead of hitting everyone equally, the government slapped heavy taxes on salt, a daily necessity everyone needed, especially before refrigerators existed. Suddenly, the state was rolling in dough through corvée labor. As the empire grew, so did taxes. The Tang Dynasty introduced a 2-tax system to simplify things. Pay twice a year, once in summer, once in fall, calculated based on your land size and how many mouths you feed. In theory, fair enough. In practice, tax collectors had a flexible understanding of fairness. Then came the salt tax, the quiet empire builder. Instead of taxing everyone equally, the government hit salt hard. An everyday essential. Everyone needed it, especially before refrigerators were a thing. And voila, the state scored big bucks. For centuries, salt revenue funded armies, palaces, and officials' pensions. It's fair to say salt sponsored dynasties, but taxes weren't just about funding, they were about control. Census taking was practically an art form, just like land surveys and household registrations. The goal, exactly how much rice you grew, how many sons you had, and whether you hid that second cow. Of course, not everything ran smoothly or peacefully. Sky-high taxes were a major spark for peasant revolts, like the Yellow Turban Rebellion at the end of the Han Dynasty, when starving farmers were still expected to hand over 30% of their rice. Well, bad things tended to happen way before modern accountants, started hassling you for your W-2 forms. Ancient Mesopotamians invented the fine art of taxing with clay tablets and reed pens, showing zero mercy for creative deductions. Between the Tigris and Euphrates, Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians built the world's first tax system, along with the first recorded gripes about taxes in history. Instead of paper forms, scribes etched tax records into soft clay. Thousands of these cuneiform tablets tracked everything from barley yields to livestock counts. If you think your local tax office moves slow, try waiting on a guy carving symbols into mud to record your grain tax. Taxes were mostly paid in barley in early city-states like Uruk and Lagash. Farmers had to hand over part of their harvest to temples or palaces, and temples weren't just religious centers, they were economic hubs with tax officials, warehouses, and shockingly strict priests. But it wasn't all about grain. Mesopotamians also taxed fishermen on their catch, merchants on their goods, and craftsmen on their workshops. Even donkeys weren't safe. Got a donkey or a cart, congrats. You just became a small taxed transport business under Babylon's king Hammurabi. The tax system got even tighter. His famous law code, one of the oldest around, laid down penalties for tax evasion, officials who overcharged, and system fraud. Sometimes, the punishment wasn't just fines, it could be death or even dismemberment. So, if you think your modern tax forms are harsh, just be glad you aren't risking losing a limb. A unique twist in Mesopotamian taxes was their integrations into public works. People could pay with bricks, silver, or labor, helping build canals, ziggurat temples, and city walls. If you couldn't pay with goods, the state might take your time or your kids' time. Nothing screams financial responsibility like lending your child to the temple for a while, despite its age. Mesopotamia's tax system was insanely effective. It managed sprawling cities, funded irrigation networks, and supported armies. In other words, it kept the whole operation from collapsing like a sun-baked mud brick. In ancient Greece, taxes were less about state order and more about awkward bill splitting. Unlike centralized empires like Egypt or China, many Greek city-states, especially Athens, relied on a mix of civic pride, social pressure, and cleverly disguised tax dodges. Let's start with the basics. Direct taxes on citizens were rare. Athenians didn't pay income tax like we do today. Instead, they were expected to chip in via ceremonies, fancy way of saying, hey rich guy, your turn to fund a play, a worship, or a festival. Technically not a tax, but try saying no and still getting invited to dinner. Meanwhile, foreigners and resident doctors working in Athens still had to pay up. They were on the hook for a state order that was more about awkwardly passing the bill, unlike centralized empires like Egypt or China. Many Greek city-states, especially Athens, relied on a mix of civic pride, social pressure, and cleverly disguised tax evasion. Let's start with the basics. Direct taxes on citizens were pretty rare. Athenians didn't have income tax like we do today. Nope. Instead, they were expected to chip in for the state through ceremonies, fancy way of saying, hey, rich guy, your turn to pay for a play, a worship, or a festival, technically, not a tax. But try saying no and still get invited to dinner. Meanwhile, foreigners and doctors living and working in Athens had to pay taxes. They were hit with a monthly protection fee to cover benefits for non-citizens. Basically, thanks for living here. Now pay up. Trade was another gold mine. Goods flowing through the busy Piraeus port meant Athens raked in customs duties, tolls, and docking fees. You could tax olives, wine, or pottery. But good luck taxing ideas. Those pearls just spilled out of philosophers' mouths, who of course had opinions on taxes. Plato thought rulers should live humbly and serve the state, not profit from it. Aristotle, the eternal realist, saw taxes as a necessary part of governance, though he noted that they could quickly become exploitative and deadly. What started as community duty turned into a nightmare during. Meanwhile, average Athenians just wanted tax collectors to stay far away from their grape harvests. Which brings us to the real villains of the story, the tax collectors. Instead of collecting taxes themselves, Greek states auctioned off the right to tax. The highest bidder paid the state up front, but then squeezed out the money plus plenty of extra fees. These tax collectors were basically the wet blankets at a party nobody wanted to attend. Chaos aside, the system sort of worked. Taxes funded temples, wars, roads, and believe it or not, even democracy. But resentment simmered, especially among the poor, and tax abuses sometimes led to public outrage, lawsuits, or exile. Welcome to the Inca Empire, where you didn't pay taxes in money or even cocoa beans. Nope, you paid with your hands, feet, and spine. The Incas built one of the most impressive civilizations in the Americas, stretching across modern Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Chile. And they did it without coins, markets, or even a written language. So how'd they fund all this? With a labor tax system called MITA. MITA isn't a suggestion, it's a government mandate. Every able-bodied man owed the empire a set number of workdays per year, usually spent building roads, farming state land, mining silver, or hauling stone for temples and fortresses. Think of the Inca tax form more like a calendar than a bill. The genius of Mita A was how efficient it was. Instead of lumping all the work in one spot, the empire spread the workforce across thousands of local communities called Ailu. Each sent workers when called upon, and in return, the empire provided food, tools, and access to shared resources. You showed up, worked, and survived, so need a bridge over a canyon. Here's your arrow. Want hundreds of miles of paved roads connecting cities like Cusco and Machu Picchu Mitas got you covered? Dream of a giant stone temple where each block weighs as much as a bus? Yep, that too. But taxes weren't just muscle power. People were also expected to farm state fields, raise llamas for transport, and weave cloth for the army and nobles. Entire regions specialized in corn, potatoes, or textiles for redistribution. The empire stored all this in massive warehouses called kolkas, strategically placed along roads for use during famine or war. Unlike many ancient civilizations, The Incas didn't use tax collectors in the usual sense. Instead, local leaders kept quipus, those knotted string devices used to track labor and production. Who needs writing when you have the most complex tax abacus ever made out of strings? And yes, there was resistance after the Spanish arrived. They forced Maida workers into brutal mining labor, turning what was once a community duty into a deadly nightmare. During the Islamic Golden Age, from the 8th to the 13th century, empires in the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Europe rolled out some of the most sophisticated tax systems the world had seen since Rome. But unlike earlier crude models, Islamic taxes came wrapped in moral philosophy, religious duty, and meticulous bookkeeping. At the heart of it all was zakat, a religious tax and one of Islam's 5 pillars. This wasn't just a donation, it was mandatory. Every capable Muslim was expected to give about 2.5% of their wealth annually to help the poor, debtors, and stranded travelers. The Islamic Golden Age from the 8th to 13th centuries, Middle Eastern, North African, and some European empires developed some of the most sophisticated tax systems the world had seen since Rome. But unlike earlier crude models, Islamic taxes were tied to moral philosophy, religious duty, and meticulous bookkeeping. At the heart of it all was zakat, a religious tax and one of Islam's 5 pillars. It wasn't just a donation, it was mandatory. Every capable Muslim was expected to give about 2.5% of their wealth annually to help the poor, the indebted, and stranded travelers. This tax wasn't for palaces or armies, but to promote social justice. Think of it as an early wealth redistribution plan, overseen by God. But zakat was just the beginning. There was also kharaj, a land tax on non-Muslims farming conquered lands, and jizya, a tribute non-Muslims paid for protection and exemption from military service. These taxes weren't arbitrary. They were law-defined, scaled by wealth, and often negotiated. And jizya, a tax that non-Muslims had to pay in exchange for protection and exemption from military service. These taxes weren't just random grabs. They were set by law, scaled by wealth, and often negotiated. Between the community and the ruler, non-Muslims could keep their religion and local customs as long as they paid up on time. To handle all this, the caliphs built a professional class of clerks and accountants. They kept records in Arabic, tracked markets, and issued receipts. The diwan, or state treasury, wasn't some chaotic coin chest, but a bureaucratic machine with trained staff and standardized forms. Think Excel sheets, but on parchment. A unique feature of Islamic taxes was their link to market regulation. Officials called mutasib roamed the markets to ensure fair prices, honest weights, and good ethics. If you tried to hide your profits from zakat, the mutasib might show up with scales, a stern look, and maybe a Quran quote. Sure, corruption wasn't non-existent, but there were regular audits and public accountability. Some rulers, like Umar ibn al-Khattab, were famous for disguising themselves to roam the streets, checking if the tax burden was crushing the people in many ways. Taxes during the Islamic Golden Age balanced profit with piety. They built schools, hospitals, libraries, and sparked an intellectual boom that influenced Europe for centuries. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, paying taxes wasn't a civic duty, it was surviving feudal extortion, and most of the money went straight into the pockets of kings and nobles who claimed divine right. Meanwhile, peasants felt every coin, every chicken, and every bundle of hay vanish into the tax collector's wagon. The most notorious medieval tax was the tithe. This wasn't a state tax, but a mandatory 10% cut of your income that had to go to the church. That means a tenth of your crops, livestock, or fish got delivered straight to the local monastery. Refuse to pay. You weren't just dodging taxes, you risked eternal damnation. Hard to argue with a tax backed by the threat of hellfire. Then came feudal taxes. If you were a peasant, your life was basically a subscription service for your lord. You paid for the land you farmed, the mill you used, the bakery oven where you baked your bread. Got married, that's a fee. Inherited your dad's field, another fee. Had a bumper harvest. Expect a cheerful tax collector showing up with a flyer listing new creative charges. In England, after the Norman conquest, taxation got more organized and scary. The Domesday Book, compiled under William the Conqueror, was a massive survey of who owned what, even how many pigs were hiding in the backyards. Basically, it was the sniper scope of tax collectors, and no one escaped its sight. By the 13th century, kings found new ways to raise cash, especially for war in France and England. Monarchies started levying direct taxes on income and property, but centralized power came with rage. Tax collectors were often hated more than the enemy's army, and when the state pushed too far, rebellion was the result. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 blew up over brutally harsh taxes, a flat fee per person. Rich or poor, that's like charging a lord and a peasant the same amount and expecting no one to notice in medieval times. Spoiler, they noticed. Taxes in medieval Europe were a tightrope walk enough to fund castles, cathedrals, and crusades, but not so much to spark uprisings and arson. And so, from cocoa beans to urine, from rice to forced labor, ancient taxes weren't just about economics. They were about power, control, and the fragile thread between ruler and ruled. One coin, one grain, one riot at a time, with Vikings. Death wasn't the end. It was just churches and crusades. But not so much that everything ended in chaos and fire. So, from cocoa beans to urine, from rice to forced labor, ancient taxes weren't just about money. They were about power, control, and the fragile thread between rulers and the ruled. One coin, one grain, one rebellion at a time for Vikings. Death wasn't the end, it was just the start of a new journey. Life was fleeting, unpredictable, and sometimes brutal. But death, that's where the real adventure kicked off. Depending on how you lived, or more importantly, how you died, you could end up in some very different afterlife spots. The hottest ticket was Valhalla, Odin's golden palace, where fallen warriors partied, fought, and prepped for Ragnarok, the apocalypse of all apocalypses. But hold up, to score a ticket to Valhalla, you've got to die in battle, ideally while doing something heroic and, bloody. You battle death. No worries. There's Folkvanger, the realm of goddess Freya, who gets first dibs on the losers. Her hall's supposed to be just as cool, just with fewer head injuries involved, but not every soul makes it to warrior heaven. Those who die of sickness, old age, or just plain cowardice get shipped down to hell, a gloomy realm ruled by a goddess of the same name. Unlike modern ideas, this hell isn't really a punishment, more like a harsher afterlife, with fewer drinking horns and battle songs. With such a detailed spiritual map, it's no surprise Viking funerals were meticulously staged, part tribute, part sole GPS, and part show-off for the living. A well-organized funeral screamed respect. Wealth and social status, screw it up, and you risk hauntings, bad luck, or worse, a disgraced, restless spirit. These funerals weren't about saying goodbye. They were about making sure the dead traveled safely to the afterlife and proved they still mattered, whether alive or dead. Even the humblest funeral might include food, weapons, and personal stuff to prep the deceased for their journey. And for the high rollers, the Norse didn't do subtle. Chiefs, warriors, and nobles got epic funerals boats, fires, burial mounds, animal sacrifices, the whole 9 yards, all executed with chilling precision. The goal wasn't just to honor the dead, but to cement their legacy in legend and memory, because in Viking culture, being remembered equals living forever. Funerals weren't the last chapter, they were the opening scene of the afterlife. Vikings didn't just dump the dead in a hole and forget them. They prepared them carefully, intentionally, with a bit of theatrical flair. If death was a journey, the dead needed to dress and pack like travelers. When someone died, their body was washed, hair brushed, and dressed in their finest clothes. This wasn't vanity. It was symbolic. Cleanliness showed respect, and the fancy outfit guaranteed the dead entered the afterlife with honor. A chief might wear a luxurious woolen tunic, a cloak trimmed with fur. A shield maiden could sport embroidered dresses decorated with brooches and beads. Jewelry wasn't just for show, it was spiritual luggage. Weapons were a must. A warrior might be buried with a sword, axe, or spear, plus a shield. These weren't just props. They were legit tools for the afterlife. After all, if you're fighting all day in Valhalla, you want your favorite sword handy. Even common folk sometimes got buried with knives or simple tools. Showing usefulness mattered as much as status. The dead also got grave goods, drinking cups, cooking pots, combs, dice, and sometimes food and mead, like packing snacks and entertainment for a very long trip. These items served practical, religious, and emotional purposes. Sometimes, people broke these objects before burial, a ritual possibly meant to free the soul of the item. Social status played a huge role in what you took on your afterlife trip. The richer or more important you were, the fancier your preparations. Their favorite sword by their side. Even common folk sometimes got buried with knives or simple tools. Showing usefulness mattered as much as status. The dead also received grave goods, drinking cups, cooking pots, combs, dice, and sometimes food and mead, like they were packing snacks and entertainment for a very long trip. These items served practical, religious, and emotional purposes. In some cases, they were deliberately smashed before burial, a ritual believed to free the spirit of the object. Social status played a huge role in afterlife prep. The richer or more important you were, the fancier the send-off. There are records of servants or slaves being sacrificed to join their masters. Though these instances were rare, there are records of servants or slaves being sacrificed to join their masters in the afterlife. Although these cases were rare and usually reserved for high-ranking individuals, brutal, sure, but according to Viking belief, accompanying your lord to the next world was an honor. After preparations, the body was laid out for a while so the community could mourn, reflect, and say their goodbyes. This was also when religious rituals kicked into serious gear. Prayers, hymns, and even storytelling ceremonies would take place to cement the legacy of the dearly departed. For Vikings, prepping the dead wasn't rocket science. It was more like love, respect, and cosmic duty. They weren't just dressing a corpse. They were gearing up a soul for the journey ahead. When most folks think Viking funerals, they picture a flaming ship drifting off into the sunset, sails ablaze, ferrying a warrior to Valhalla. That image is deeply embedded in pop culture. Movies, dramatic, and a bit over the top, but how accurate is it? The short answer, partly true, partly poetic license. Vikings had a deep bond with their ships. These weren't just rides from A to B. They symbolized power, status, and life itself. Being buried on a ship, or a piece of one, was the ultimate farewell for seafarers, warriors, and nobles. It meant returning to the sea, to the gods, or to the epic journey ahead. But contrary to popular belief, most Viking funeral ships were not set on fire and pushed out to sea. That image probably comes from a mashup of medieval myths and 19th century romantic paintings. Reality: burying a whole ship was super rare and crazy expensive. When it did happen, the ship usually sat on land, the body and grave goods arranged inside, and the whole thing was either buried under a mound or burned right there. One famous example is the Oseberg burial in Norway. Inside was a finely carved ship carrying two richly dressed women, surrounded by fabrics, sledges, and animal offerings. No flames, just earth and legacy. Another example, the Gokstad burial held a chieftain's body, weapons, tools, and even sacrificial horses. Again, no water, no fire, just honor and craftsmanship. That said, cremation rituals involving boats or symbolic boat images did exist. In some areas, smaller boats or stone boat shapes were used in cremations. With the pyre built right on top, these events were spectacular. If logistically simple, burning an entire ship took tons of wood, space, and a heart of steel. The fire wasn't just for show. In Viking belief, fire purified the soul, sending smoke up to the gods, It also kept the dead from coming back as restless spirits, a very real nightmare in Norse mythology. Viking funerals weren't just fancy parties, they were investments in the afterlife. The dead didn't go empty-handed. Instead, they were loaded with grave goods, a spiritual starter pack designed to guarantee comfort, status, and survival in the next world. Let's start with the basics. Most Viking burials, from common farmers to big shots, included tools, weapons, and personal items. A man might be buried with his sword, axe, or bow. A woman could have keys, brooches, weaving tools, or even cooking pots. These weren't just symbolic trinkets. They believed the soul would use them after death in whatever realm they ended up in, Valhalla or Hell. No one wanted to show up unarmed or without their essentials. The richer folks got fancier funerals. Some burials included drinking horns, board games, imported silk, musical instruments, and even carts or sledges. A woman in the famous Oseberg grave was buried with an elaborately decorated cart, 5 intricately carved animals, and dozens of textiles enough to open a boutique in the afterlife. But what really sets Viking funerals apart was their use of animals in sacrifice. Horses were popular companions in elite funerals, symbolizing status, transport, and power, opening a boutique in the afterlife. But what really sets Viking funerals apart is their use of animals for sacrifice. Horses were the go-to companions at elite funerals, status symbols, wheels to the afterlife, and power badges rolled into one. Archaeologists have dug up graves with multiple horses carefully laid out, clearly meant as offerings for the occasion. Dogs, hawks, even cattle show up too, each chosen for some spiritual or symbolic reason. Sometimes, the sacrifices went beyond animals. Slaves or servants might be killed and buried with their masters. It wasn't just cruelty. It was seen as ultimate loyalty or service. But let's be honest, from a modern view, that's pretty grim. Some stories, like Ahmad ibn Fadlan's, describe shocking rituals where a slave girl was ritualistically killed to accompany a chieftain to the afterlife, believing she'd keep serving him after death. Everything placed in the grave, alive or dead, had a purpose. Vikings believed souls needed support, just like in life. Grave goods were gifts, tools, and protections showing status and role across the universe. For Vikings, death wasn't just kicking someone out of the world. It left a mark, often huge, unmistakable, and visible for miles. Enter the burial mound, or hoer in Old Norse, a carefully built hill over the dead to honor life, deeds, and, let's be real, social status. These weren't just dirt piles. Viking burial mounds were monuments constructed with effort and care. Chieftains' mounds could be built over a ship or a buried wooden chamber, packed with grave goods and sealed with layers of stones and earth. Some were grass-covered to blend with the landscape. Others left raw and rock-hard, sending a permanent message to the living someone important lies here. Size mattered. The bigger the mound, the greater the legacy. These weren't just graves. They were status symbols, tangible reminders of power, wealth, and family origins. Sometimes, mounds were arranged in specific patterns, forming ship shapes or ritual alignments with celestial events. Yeah, Vikings were practical, but also deeply symbolic. These mounds served community roles too. They became sacred spots, places for memorials and storytelling. Families could gather there for seasonal rituals, feasts, or oaths. Burial mounds acted as bridges between generations, between the living and the dead, and sometimes they weren't happy. With just one burial, mounds could hold multiple graves, added over time, turning a single tomb into a dynasty monument. In this way, the land wasn't just for the living, the dead claimed it too, shaping identity and memory for centuries. Not all Viking burials were this grand. Common folk might get flat graves or simple stone circles, especially where land and space made mounds impossible. But even those got attention. Grave goods, ashes, and orientation toward the sun or stars. A reminder that even in humble death, the Viking spirit sought meaning. Burn or bury. That's the eternal Viking funeral dilemma. And the answer depended on region, status, era, and beliefs. While modern Viking imagery leans toward dramatic fires and fiery send-offs, the truth is more complicated. Vikings used both cremation and burial, often side by side in the same community. Let's start with cremation. Early Viking times, especially in Sweden and parts of Denmark. Cremation was the default. The body was placed on a funeral pyre surrounded by grave goods and set ablaze. Fire wasn't just destruction, it was purification, spiritual release. The smoke carried the soul up, maybe to Odin, or maybe to some totally different realm. After the flames died down, ashes and burnt bones were carefully collected and buried in urns or scattered in stone-lined graves. But cremation wasn't just about sending souls to the gods. It also had practical purposes. In cramped societies, or where wild animals threatened shallow graves, fire made sense. And let's not forget the psychological angle. Cremation ensured the dead didn't come back. Norse mythology had plenty of restless spirits, immortal warriors, and demons. Turning bodies to ashes made haunting a lot less likely to happen over time, especially by the end of the Viking Age. Burying intact bodies got way more popular, mostly thanks to Christianity crashing the party. Burial fit better with Christian ideas about resurrection and keeping the body safe. But even before Christianity showed up, some Viking groups were already into indoor burials, ship burials, or wooden coffins, with the body decked out in full gear, surrounded by goods, animals, and tools. Funny thing is, both cremation and burial often coexisted. A chieftain might get cremated while his wife gets buried nearby, or warriors might be cremated and farmers or merchants buried. The choice probably reflected personal identity, social class, or local customs. The common thread, detail, and respect, whether turned to smoke or buried under a mound. Vikings treated their dead like honored travelers heading to the afterlife. No matter how they got there, Viking funerals weren't quiet affairs. They were full-on farewell parties packed with music, storytelling, cheers, and symbolic gestures. Handling the body, whether cremated, buried, or sent off on a boat, was necessary. But the rituals for the living were just as crucial. Dying well was one thing, but being remembered properly, that was immortality. A big part of Viking funerals was singing and poetry. Toasts and poets played a huge role in keeping the memory of the dead alive. They'd compose poems and eulogies recounting deeds, heritage, victories, and even the quirks of the departed. These weren't sad little ditties. They were epic, painting the dead as legendary heroes straight out of saga. If you didn't get sung about at your own funeral, could you even call yourself a Viking? Funerals also included the ritual of raising a horn. Called minnie, people passed around drinking horns, pouring the booze, and each toast honored not just the dead, but gods, ancestors, and fate itself. These moments were solemn yet cozy, mixing grief with camaraderie. It was pain expressed with fire and fermented honey. Offerings were often made at the grave, sometimes food, sometimes weapons, sometimes blood. Animal sacrifices often accompanied funerals, meant to guide or keep the soul company in the afterlife. These rituals were usually led by a priest or shaman, performing ceremonies with chants, symbolic gestures, and probably some unprintable magic words. Wealthy funerals were all about ceremony and spectacle. Ibn Fadlan, a 10th century Arab diplomat, famously described a Rus's chieftain's funeral, probably a Norse settler along the Volga, which involved days of preparation, animal sacrifices, and the ritual killing of a slave girl who volunteered to join her master. Horrifying by today's standards, sure, but it shows how seriously Vikings took religious and theatrical flair in death. Memorials might happen weeks later. To wrap things up, redistribute property, and honor legacy. New leaders could be announced, oaths sworn, stories retold. For Vikings, death wasn't just loss. It was a tale to tell, a song to sing, and a life to honor with fire, voice, and booze. While fire burnt the body and song carried the soul, stones kept the names alive. In Viking society, memory wasn't left to chance. It was carved, letter by letter, into the very bone of the earth, and from this came the runestones, one of the Vikings' oldest traditions. Runestones weren't gravestones in the modern sense. You didn't just put a little marker next to a plot. You built a public monument for all to admire, read, and respect, a tribute to their legacy. New leaders might be named, oaths sworn, stories retold. For Vikings, death wasn't just a loss. It was a story to tell, a song to sing, and a life to honor with fire, voice, and drinks. While fire burns the body and the song carries the soul, the stone holds onto the name. Viking society didn't leave memory up to chance. It was carved letter by letter deep into the earth's bones, and thus the runestone tradition was born. One of the oldest Viking customs. Runestones aren't your modern tombstones. You don't just slap a little marker next to a plot. You build a public monument for everyone to admire, read, and respect. These stones lined roads, near bridges, at crossroads and beside burial mounds, boldly declaring the life and legacy of the dead. The inscriptions were carved in runes, an alphabet used all across the Norse world. Some were simple. Gunnar raised this stone in memory of his brother. Others were epic sagas recounting voyages, battles, and victories. Some even cursed anyone who dared mess with the stone. If you move this stone, your bones will rot and your cattle will dry up. Vikings were no joke. While many stones honor warriors and leaders, others remember merchants, travelers, and even women. A famous example is the East Stone in Denmark. These giant stones were raised by King Harald Bluetooth to honor his parents and announce Denmark's Christian conversion. They mixed pagan traditions with the new Christian wave, showing how runestones evolved over time. Carving runestones along travel routes wasn't cheap. It took a skilled rune master, time, and a big stone, usually granite or sandstone, but the payoff was immortality. Raising a stone meant this life mattered. This person won't be forgotten. Even centuries later, their words still echo through time. Some stones feature images, ships, weapons, animals, or symbols of power. Others get abstract, twisting runes into snake shapes or dragon curves. The art was as much part of the message as the words. In a world run on oral tradition, where stories passed mouth to ear, runestones were a physical anchor, a reminder you just couldn't skip, carved right into the world itself, despite all their power and stoicism. Vikings had one nagging fear that fire, stone, or swords couldn't easily fix. The dead just wouldn't stay dead, because in Norse belief, not every soul passes on peacefully. Some stick around, some come back, and some flat out refuse to leave. These are the shamblers, restless dead rising from graves with swollen bodies, blazing eyes, and terrible attitudes. Not your usual ghostly wisps. They're solid, dangerous, and nasty, known for crushing bones, breaking down doors, and sometimes sitting on sleeping folks like a sweaty revenge rock. Viking horror movie, but you might actually know the guy in your village. So how does someone become a shambler? Usually a bad death or a messed up life. Greedy, violent, or shameless jerks top the list. An unfinished business doesn't help. Jealousy, revenge, debt, or just deep hate for family. A lousy funeral can also spawn an unhappy soul. If burial's sloppy or grave goods get stolen, the dead might decide to come back. To prevent this, Viking funerals included protective rituals. Sometimes bodies got heavy stones placed on top to pin them down. Other graves show signs of spear or stake stabbings, a prevention tactic any modern vampire hunter would admire. In cremation, the body got fully burned, not just for cleansing, but to destroy any form the soul might return in. But not all lingering dead were bad news. Some were ancestor spirits guiding or guarding family land. These spirits, called fylgir or dissie, could be protective if treated with respect. They often got seasonal offerings and silent prayers at their graves. Even the afterlife had its drama. A warrior's soul might spend forever battling in Valhalla, which sounds glorious until you realize it's an eternal war with no weekends. Vikings kept fighting even after death. In the end, death was never just the end. It was a beginning, a warning, content with seasonal offerings and silent prayers at the grave. Not even the afterlife escaped the stress. A warrior's soul might spend eternity fighting in Valhalla. Sounds glorious until you realize it's an endless battle with no weekends off. Vikings kept struggling even after death. In the end, death was never just the end. It was a beginning, a warning, a haunting, and a story. The dead never really disappear. They linger in smoke, song, stone, and sometimes in footsteps you swear you hear right behind you.